under the hot, humming light of the East African sun, a kingdom rose, not by marching armies but by the scent of cloves drifting on warm sea air. Imagine stepping off a dhow at dawn, gulls calling, the harbor alive with voices in Arabic, Swahili, and Gujarati, and the streets breathing out the sweetness of cinnamon and nutmeg. In Zanzibar, gold didn't shine in coins. It dusted your fingers when you handled spice. Power wasn't a banner snapping in the wind. It was the crated cargo that left at high tide. And faith, you could hear it in the rhythm of daily prayers, woven into the same streets where deals were struck and journeys began. Welcome to the Sultanate of Zanzibar, where the aroma of wealth masked quiet struggles, ambition testing loyalty, trade rubbing against conscience, and a steady tug-of-war between spiritual light and the darker shades of human desire. Here's the part that hooks you. How did a coral island become the beating heart of an ocean-wide network? Picture a reef-ringed shore that seems, at first glance, small and delicate. Then look again. From this island, ships traced silver lines across the Indian Ocean, to Muscat and Bombay, to Mombasa and beyond. Merchants wrote letters scented with clove oil, courtyards filled with ledgers and whispered bargains. And in the middle of it all, sultans who knew that real power could be measured not in fortresses, but in contracts, alliances, and the price of a good harvest. But success never arrives alone. It brings choices. A young trader named Saeed, let's walk with him for a moment, starts the morning with sweet tea and a ledger cramped with numbers. He dreams of a bigger warehouse, a faster ship, a name that carries weight in Stone Town. He also hears news that makes him pause. A family is broken apart on the mainland. Someone he once knew has vanished into a caravan road that does not lead home. The island smells of clove blossoms and fresh bread, yet there's a silence underneath, a question hanging in the air. How far can prosperity go before it asks too much of the human heart? By the time the afternoon call to prayer floats over the rooftops, the town is buzzing. You can hear the carpenters tapping at cedar doors, see scribes blotting ink that shines like black shell. The Sultan's envoys move through the alleys with measured steps, and rumor travels faster than any horse. New taxes, new treaties, a new ship from Oman. Some celebrate modernization, running water, electric lamps, a house whose very name whispers wonder. Others feel the pinch and wonder who truly benefits when a port gleams at dusk. Here's the turning question, the one that pulls us forward. What happened when the thirst for influence pressed too hard against the island's soul? When plans grew grander than the trust that held them together? In Zanzibar, triumph and tension were neighbors. Even the sea seemed to know it. On some evenings, storms gathered at the horizon like unspoken thoughts. On others, the water lay calm as silk, as if promising that trade winds could carry everyone safely, if only choices were lighter. And this is where you and I come in. If you love history and want to uncover how real people, sultans, sailors, poets, and porters, shape the world we live in, stay close. There's mystery here worth your time. Threads that stretch from Stone Town balconies to modern kitchens where a pinch of clove still transforms a meal. Like this journey? Tap like, subscribe to the Medieval Archives, and don't miss the next chapter. We're just getting started. Picture this. You're standing on a harbor dock in the 1800s and the air itself feels like money. Not metaphorically, literally. Every breath you take is thick with the scent of cloves, so potent and valuable that merchants across 3 continents are willing to risk storms, pirates, and disease just to fill their ships with these tiny brown buds. This is Zanzibar, and in this moment, you're witnessing something extraordinary. A coral island barely 30 miles long has somehow become the beating heart of global commerce, the place where fortunes are made and shattered before the tide can turn twice. Walk with me through Stone Town on a typical morning. The sun hasn't fully risen, but the streets are already alive. You hear the calls of dhow captains preparing their vessels, the rhythmic hammering of craftsmen working carved wooden doors that will stand for centuries, and somewhere in the distance, the haunting beauty of the call to prayer. The smell hits you in waves. Cloves, yes, but also cardamom, cinnamon, and the salt of the Indian Ocean mixing with something else, something harder to name. It's the scent of ambition, of dreams crossing borders. The numbers tell a staggering story. At its height, Zanzibar's plantations produced 9/10 of all the cloves in the world. 9/10. Imagine controlling nearly the entire supply of something every kitchen and apothecary from London to Calcutta desperately wanted. Ships arrived daily from Oman, from Gujarat, from Mombasa. Their holds empty and their captains hungry for cargo. They left riding low in the water, weighted down with spices that would sell for small fortunes thousands of miles away. But here's where the story gets complicated, where the sweet smell of success starts to carry bitter notes underneath. Because Zanzibar wasn't just trading cloves and ivory. The island had become the largest hub for another kind of commerce entirely, the trade in human beings. While sultans commissioned breathtaking mosques with intricate Arabic calligraphy and courtyards that caught the breeze just so, while they installed some of the first electric lights in all of Africa and built palaces that made European diplomats gasp, there were markets where families were torn apart, where people became property. Let me tell you about someone who lived through this contradiction. His name was Saeed, not the Sultan, but an ordinary young merchant trying to make his way in this golden, terrible age. Saeed came from a modest Arab family that had settled in Zanzibar 2 generations back. His father taught him the spice trade, how to judge the quality of a clove harvest by rolling a single bud between your fingers, how to negotiate prices in 3 languages, how to read the monsoon winds that dictated when ships could sail. Saeed had dreams, the kind of dreams young people everywhere understand. He wanted his own warehouse, his own trading company. He wanted to walk through Stone Town and have people nod with respect, to build a house with a fountain in the courtyard where water would play over blue tiles. He worked hard, rising before dawn to check inventories, staying up late by candlelight to practice his accounting. He was good at what he did. People noticed. Then one day, Saeed received news that changed everything. His younger sister, Amina, whom he remembered laughing as she helped their mother grind spices in the kitchen, had been sold. Their cousin on the mainland, drowning in debt, had made a choice that shattered their family. Amina was gone, taken inland along routes that led into the African interior, routes from which few returned. Saeed stood on the harbor that morning, watching the ships, and suddenly the whole glittering enterprise of Zanzibar looked different. The wealth that had seemed so pure, so full of possibility, was tangled up with something he could no longer ignore. Every ship that left might carry cloves worth hundreds of pounds sterling, but it might also carry people like Amina, people who had names and families and dreams of their own. This is the duality that defined Zanzibar in those years. The sultans genuinely believed they were building something magnificent, a crossroads of cultures where Swahili, Arabic, and Persian influences created architecture and poetry unlike anywhere else on earth. And they did create beautiful things. The House of Wonders, a palace so advanced it had elevators when most of Europe was still climbing stairs. But that same House of Wonders was built on wealth that flowed partly from human suffering. Ivory told a similar story. 60,000 elephant tusks moved through Zanzibar's markets every year. 60,000. Each one represented days of tracking through dense forests, dangerous encounters, and the labor of porters who carried these massive objects to the coast. The ivory became piano keys in Vienna, billiard balls in New York, carved ornaments that decorated the finest homes. But the cost, measured in broken ecosystems and human exhaustion, was enormous. Saeed found himself caught between worlds. He still needed to trade to survive. His livelihood depended on the very system that had stolen his sister. Some nights he would sit on his roof and watch the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that guided the dhows across open water, and wonder, what price was too high? When did prosperity demand too much of a person's conscience? The fascinating thing is that these questions weren't unique to Saeed. All across Zanzibar, people were wrestling with similar tensions. There were sultans who issued decrees against certain practices, even while profiting from them. There were European abolitionists who condemned the trade in people while eagerly buying the spices that trade helped fund. There were African merchants who had themselves escaped bondage, but now participated in the commerce that had once threatened them. History often presents these situations in black and white, heroes and villains. But Zanzibar in the 19th century was painted in shades of gray, in the complex colors of real human decisions made under pressure, with limited options, in a world that was rapidly changing. By mid-century, the island had become something unprecedented, a truly global crossroads where you might hear a dozen languages in a single morning, where architectural styles from 3 continents mixed in ways that created something entirely new. Stone Town's narrow alleys held Indian merchants' homes with elaborate balconies, Arab townhouses with cool interior courtyards, and African neighborhoods where Swahili culture thrived and evolved. But that mixing, that cosmopolitan energy, rested on an unstable foundation. The wealth wasn't evenly distributed. The laborers in the clove plantations, working from dawn until their hands were stained dark and their backs ached, saw little of the profit. The porters who carried ivory from the interior earned barely enough to survive. Meanwhile, a small elite lived in comfort that rivaled anything in Europe or Arabia. Said eventually made a choice. The historical records are thin. We don't know every detail. But we know he used his position to help several people escape, to find their way to freedom. It cost him. He lost trading partners, faced suspicion from authorities, never built that grand house he dreamed of. But years later, when he was an old man sitting in a modest home overlooking the harbor, he would tell his grandchildren that some dreams matter more than others. The island's story is ultimately about that tension between what we want and what we're willing to do to get it. Zanzibar became fabulously wealthy, yes. It punched far above its weight on the world stage. But that wealth came with questions that couldn't be dodged forever, moral debts that eventually came due. The sultans built their mosques and palaces, created centers of learning, patronized poets and scholars. They also presided over markets where human dignity was bought and sold. Understanding Zanzibar means holding both truths at once: the genuine cultural achievements and the terrible costs, the breathtaking beauty and the hidden suffering, the dreams of young merchants and the nightmares of those who lost everything. It's complicated, messy, thoroughly human. And perhaps that's why this story still matters today. Because we're still making similar calculations, still weighing prosperity against principles, still asking ourselves, how much is too much? Where the line falls between success and selling our souls. The setting changes, the specific circumstances shift, but the fundamental questions Said faced on that Zanzibar rooftop remain remarkably current. The island that was worth an empire turns out to be worth something else as well. A mirror, showing us truths about ourselves we might prefer not to see, but desperately need to understand. Imagine being handed an entire kingdom at age 25, with all its glory and all its problems wrapped up together like a gift you're not sure you want to open. That was Bargash bin Said in the year 1870, standing in his palace overlooking the Indian Ocean, suddenly responsible for an island that had become too important, too wealthy, and too complicated for any one person to manage easily. Bargash wasn't supposed to be Sultan. He was the third son, the one who'd spent his youth studying poetry and philosophy, learning French and English from European tutors, dreaming of modernization. He'd traveled to Bombay and seen gas lamps illuminating streets at night. He'd visited British India and witnessed telegraph lines carrying messages faster than any ship. He came back to Zanzibar with his head full of ideas about what his island could become. When power finally fell to him, Bargash threw himself into transformation with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed he could drag Zanzibar into the modern age by sheer force of will. Within his first few years, he did things that seem almost impossible for a small island sultanate. He installed electric lighting in his palace. Not just any lighting, but some of the first electric lights in all of Africa. Picture that. While most African cities were still using oil lamps and candles, Stone Town had buildings where you could flip a switch and banish the darkness. He brought in running water through an elaborate system of pipes and aqueducts. He paved roads. He established a regular postal service. He even commissioned the House of Wonders, a palace so advanced it featured mechanical elevators at a time when most European buildings required you to climb stairs. Foreign diplomats who visited were genuinely stunned. Here was an African sultanate that in some ways was more technologically sophisticated than London or Paris. But here's where Bargash's story gets complicated, where the hero starts showing cracks in his armor. All this modernization cost money, enormous amounts of money. And Zanzibar, for all its wealth from cloves and ivory, didn't have endless resources. So Bargash did what seemed logical at the time. He borrowed. Heavily. Primarily from British banks and trading companies who were more than happy to extend credit to a sultan, eager to spend. The loans seemed manageable at first. A few £1,000s here for the electric generators, 10,000 there for the water system, 20,000 for the new palace. But debt has a way of accumulating, of growing faster than you expect. Within a few years, Bargash found himself owing sums that would take decades to repay. And the British, always patient, always polite, began making suggestions, small requests. Perhaps Zanzibar could grant them exclusive trading rights to certain goods. Perhaps the Sultan could sign this treaty, or allow British advisors into his government. Bargash started to realize, too late, that he'd mortgaged more than money. He'd mortgaged his independence. Meanwhile, outside the electric glow of Stone Town, a very different Zanzibar was taking shape. The common farmers, the ones who actually grew the cloves that funded everything, were struggling. Bargash's modernization required taxes, lots of taxes. Land taxes, export taxes, taxes on tools, on seeds, on the very water they used to irrigate their crops. For people already working from sunrise to sunset, the new tax burden felt crushing. In the interior of the island, in villages where the Sultan's electric lights were just rumors and the fancy House of Wonders might as well have been on the moon, a man named Mwinyi Mkuu was listening to his neighbor's complaints. Mwinyi Mkuu wasn't a nobleman or a merchant. He was a tribal leader, someone whose authority came not from palaces or foreign loans, but from the trust of his community. When people talked about their struggles, he didn't dismiss them or explain the necessity of progress. He listened. Mwinyi Mkuu was perhaps in his 40s, though accounts vary. What doesn't vary is the description of his presence. Calm, thoughtful, someone who chose words carefully and meant what he said. He'd watched the tax collectors arrive in villages, demanding payments in silver coin that farmers who dealt in barter didn't have. He'd see families forced to sell portions of their harvest at unfavorable rates just to meet government demands. And slowly, quietly, he began organizing. It wasn't a rebellion in the traditional sense, not at first. It was more like a network of resistance, a web of people who agreed to support each other, to share resources, to find ways around the most onerous demands. When tax collectors came to one village, runners would warn others. When the Sultan's officials tried to enforce new regulations, communities would suddenly become very forgetful about which fields belonged to whom, or how much had actually been harvested. Bargash, from his electrically lit office, reading reports by the light of bulbs that cost more than most farmers earned in a year, tried to understand what was happening. His advisors, many of them now British, part of the deal that came with those loans, told him the solution was simple: more enforcement, stricter penalties, a firmer hand. But something in Bargash hesitated. He'd traveled enough, read enough to understand that you can't build a modern nation by crushing the people who actually do the work. Yet what choice did he have? The British creditors wanted their money. The modernization programs, once started, couldn't simply be abandoned. The electric generators needed coal, imported at great expense. The water system required maintenance. The palace staff expected their salaries. Everything he'd built to make Zanzibar great was now demanding payment, and the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. The situation came to a head in the early 1870s. Mwinyi Mkuu's network had grown stronger, more coordinated. Entire regions of the island were effectively ignoring the Sultan's tax collectors. Some villages had stopped paying entirely, daring the authorities to do something about it. Bargash faced a choice he'd never wanted to face: send in forces to compel payment, potentially tearing the island apart, or negotiate, potentially appearing weak to both his own people and the British who were watching everything with calculating eyes. And then Bargash did something that puzzled everyone, something that became one of the great mysteries of his reign. In the year 1872, he ordered several of his own naval vessels, beautiful dhows that had been in his family for generations, to be burned, not captured by enemies, not lost in storms, deliberately destroyed by his own command. Why would a sultan burn his own ships? People whispered about it in the markets. Foreign observers filed confused reports back to their governments. Some said it was a symbolic gesture, showing that Zanzibar was turning away from its maritime past toward a modern future. Others claimed it was about debts, that the British had demanded it as part of some agreement. Still others insisted there was a secret reason, something Bargash never publicly explained. The truth, which would only become clear later, was far more complex than anyone guessed at the time. But we'll come back to that mystery. For now, just hold that image in your mind. A sultan standing on the shore, watching ships burn, smoke rising into the tropical sky, while in the interior of his island, Mwinyi Mkuu and the farmers he represented waited to see what would happen next. Bargash's reign reveals something important about the nature of progress and power. He genuinely wanted good things for his people. Unlike some rulers who were simply greedy or cruel, Bargash had vision. He could see a future where Zanzibar stood as an equal to European powers, where technology improved lives, where his island became a beacon of what African leadership could achieve. But good intentions aren't enough when you're caught between competing pressures. The British wanted control dressed up as partnership. The common people wanted relief from burdens they hadn't asked for. The merchant elite wanted stability that protected their profits. And Bargash, in the middle of all this, wanted to be remembered as the sultan who brought his kingdom into the modern age. Instead, he was becoming the sultan who pleased no one. Too modern for the traditionalists, too indebted for the nationalists, too weak for the British, too distant for the farmers. It's a position many leaders throughout history have found themselves in, trying to balance incompatible demands, making compromises that satisfy nobody, watching their dreams slowly collapse under the weight of reality. Mwinyi Mkuu, for his part, wasn't trying to overthrow Bargash or become sultan himself. That's what made him dangerous in a way that traditional rebels weren't. He simply wanted the system to acknowledge that farmers were human beings with limits, that you couldn't extract infinite resources from finite people. It was a reasonable demand. It was also one that threatened the entire economic structure Bargash had built, because that structure depended on those farmers producing more, paying more, enduring more. The standoff between the Sultan in his electric palace and the rebel in the clove groves became a defining feature of Zanzibar in the 1870s. Neither side wanted open conflict. Bargash, because he knew he'd likely lose the island's interior permanently. Mwinyi Mkuu, because he knew that violent resistance would give the British an excuse to intervene directly. So instead, they circled each other warily, testing limits, making small moves, waiting for something to shift. That shift would come, but not in the way anyone expected. The story of those burned ships, the real reason behind Bargash's seemingly incomprehensible decision, would eventually reveal itself as part of a much larger game being played across the entire Indian Ocean region. But that's a tale for another moment, another piece of this intricate puzzle. For now, remember this. History's most interesting figures are rarely pure heroes or simple villains. They're people like Bargash and Mwinyi Mkuu, doing their best in impossible situations, making choices that seem right at the time but carry consequences they can't fully predict. One man building electric lights while sinking into debt. Another man defending farmers while inadvertently weakening his island's ability to resist foreign pressure. Both of them, in their own ways, trying to do right by Zanzibar. Both of them, in their own ways, discovering that doing right is far more complicated than it appears. Sometimes history moves in slow, grinding centuries, and sometimes it explodes in 38 minutes. The morning of August 27, 1896, dawned like any other in Zanzibar. Fishermen were already at sea, their boats bobbing on gentle swells. In Stonetown, merchants were opening their shops, arranging spices in careful pyramids that caught the early light. The smell of cardamom and fresh bread drifted through narrow streets. It seemed like an ordinary day. It would be anything but. Inside the Sultan's palace, a young man named Khalid bin Bargash was making a decision that would change everything. His cousin, the Sultan Hamad, had just passed away the day before under circumstances that were, to put it mildly, suspicious. Some said it was natural causes. Others whispered about poison. What mattered was that the throne was suddenly empty, and Khalid believed it should be his. There was just one problem. The British had other ideas. By 1896, Zanzibar existed in a strange twilight zone of independence. Officially, it was still a sultanate, still ruled by its own leaders. But really, the British called most of the shots. They'd been tightening their grip for decades, ever since those loans to Bargash had opened the door. Every sultan now needed British approval. It wasn't written down in any constitution. It was just understood, the way water understands which way is downhill. The British preferred a different candidate, a man named Hamoud who they knew would cooperate with their plans. Khalid, on the other hand, had a reputation for being stubborn, for clinging to old ways, for resisting British influence. He'd already shown himself unwilling to bend on certain matters, particularly regarding the systems of forced labor that still existed on the island, despite British pressure to end them. So, when Khalid, just hours after his cousin's death, gathered supporters and marched into the palace declaring himself sultan, the British consul, a man named Basil Cave, felt his stomach drop. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. Cave sent a messenger immediately. Vacate the palace, accept Hamoud as the rightful sultan, do it now. Khalid's response was essentially, make me. Within hours, Khalid had assembled what forces he could, about 2,800 supporters, including palace guards, loyal soldiers, and civilians who believed in his claim. He had artillery pieces, including an old bronze cannon that had been defending the palace for generations. He had the palace itself, a substantial stone building that could theoretically withstand an assault. And he had something else. Pride. The kind of pride that makes you think that if you just stand firm enough, if you just refuse to back down, the other side will eventually blink first. The British didn't blink. By late afternoon on August 26th, British warships were taking positions in the harbor. 3 vessels, the St. George, the Philomel, and the Thrush, arranged themselves with their guns pointing directly at the palace. It must have been an intimidating sight. Sleek steel warships, representatives of the most powerful empire on Earth, versus one ornate palace with its outdated defenses. Cave sent another message. Leave peacefully by 9 o'clock the next morning, or face the consequences. Imagine being one of Khalid's supporters that evening. You're standing in the palace courtyard as the sun sets, painting the sky in colors that would be beautiful if you weren't so terrified. You can see the British ships out in the harbor, their shapes darkening as night falls. You know what those ships can do. You've heard stories about British naval power, about how they've subdued ports and cities across 3 continents. And here you are with old muskets and a cannon that everyone's noticed but nobody wants to say out loud. Doesn't seem to be working properly. The firing mechanism keeps jamming. Some of Khalid's supporters slipped away that night. You can't blame them. They had families, lives, reasons to see another sunrise. But many stayed, some out of loyalty, some because they believed Khalid's claim was legitimate and someone needed to stand up to British interference. Some perhaps because leaving would mean admitting that their island was no longer truly their own. Khalid himself spent the night preparing defenses and sending messages to anyone who might help. Other Arab states. The German consul, since Germany had its own interests in East Africa. Anyone. The responses that came back were variations of the same message. You're on your own. 9 o'clock in the morning on August 27th arrived. The ultimatum expired. Khalid was still in the palace. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The city held its breath. Maybe people thought maybe the British were bluffing. Maybe they wouldn't actually attack. Maybe some last-minute negotiation would... The first shell hit the palace at 9:02. The British ships opened fire with a precision that was almost clinical. They weren't trying to level the entire building or cause unnecessary casualties. They were making a point, and they made it efficiently. Shell after shell slammed into the palace walls. The old wooden sections, the beautiful carved doors that craftsmen had spent months creating, the latticed balconies where sultans had sat to catch the evening breeze. All of it splintered and burned under the bombardment. Khalid's forces tried to return fire. The palace guards shot their muskets toward the ships, though the bullets couldn't possibly reach that far. And someone, desperately, tried to get that old bronze cannon working. They loaded it, aimed it, pulled the trigger, and nothing. The mechanism was jammed, rusted, a relic from an earlier age trying futilely to face modern naval artillery. It was almost poetic in its symbolism. The old sultanate, magnificent in its time, simply couldn't function anymore against the new industrial powers that had come to reshape the world. The whole thing lasted 38 minutes. By 9:40, the palace was in ruins. Fires burned in multiple sections. The Sultan's flag, which had flown defiantly just an hour before, was shot down. Casualties among Khalid's forces were significant, about 500 people harmed, though the British ships had tried to aim away from areas where civilians might be sheltering. On the British side, one sailor injured. Khalid, realizing the situation was hopeless, fled through a back entrance. He made it to the German consulate, where he claimed asylum. The Germans, not wanting to start their own diplomatic crisis with Britain, eventually let him leave for German East Africa. He'd spend years in exile, first in German territory, then later being shuffled between different locations, a sultan without a sultanate, watching from afar as his island became increasingly British in everything but name. By mid-morning, Hamud was being installed as the new sultan. British officials were already directing cleanup crews, and the people of Stone Town were emerging from their homes, staring at the damaged palace, trying to process what had just happened. Their world had changed in less time than it takes to brew tea. Here's what strikes me about this whole episode. It wasn't really about Khalid versus Hamud, or even about who had the legitimate claim to the throne. It was about showing everyone, not just in Zanzibar, but across all of East Africa and beyond, that resistance to British power was futile. 38 minutes was all it took to make that point crystal clear. The jammed cannon tells the whole story in miniature. Here was this beautiful bronze piece, probably cast decades earlier, maintained as best as the Sultanate could manage. But by 1896, maintaining cannons required industrial infrastructure, precision engineering, the kind of supply chains that only major powers possessed. Zanzibar, for all its wealth in spices and ivory, didn't have that. It had tradition and pride and history. What it didn't have was the ability to stand against 3 warships built in British naval yards, crewed by sailors trained in the latest tactics, supplied by an empire that stretched around the globe. And you know what's fascinating? This wasn't unusual for the time. All across Africa and Asia, similar scenes were playing out. Local rulers, some of them presiding over kingdoms that had existed for centuries, suddenly finding themselves powerless against European military technology. The gap had grown too wide, too fast. Within a single generation, the balance of power had shifted so dramatically that 38 minutes was all it took to decide who ruled an entire island. For the common people of Zanzibar, the war was almost abstract. It happened so quickly that many residents barely understood what had occurred until it was over. They woke up with one sultan, ate breakfast during a brief but intense bombardment they might not have even heard depending on where they lived, and by lunch had a different sultan. Life went on. The clove harvest still needed gathering. The market still needed vendors, but something fundamental had changed. Everyone now understood, if they hadn't before, that the real power in Zanzibar didn't sit in the palace. It sat on those ships in the harbor. Khalid's story didn't end well. He spent years trying to regain his position, writing letters, making appeals, looking for allies. He never made it back. He died in exile in 1927, having outlived the very sultanate he'd briefly claimed, since by then Zanzibar was fully and officially under British control. Sometimes I wonder what he thought about during those long years of exile. Did he regret his stand? Or did he take some pride in having been the last sultan to truly resist, even if that resistance lasted less than an hour? So here's something worth thinking about. Did you know that Zanzibar had the shortest war in recorded history? 38 minutes that decided the fate of an island and became a footnote in the story of empires. If you're enjoying these stories from history, the kind of tales they don't always teach in school, do me a favor. Subscribe to the Medieval Archives. Hit that like button, share this with someone who loves history, and drop a comment. If you'd been in Stone Town that morning, would you have stood with Sultan Khalid, believing in the right to choose your own leader? Or would you have supported the British-backed Hamud, thinking that cooperation might at least spare your island from destruction? There's no easy answer, which is exactly what makes history so endlessly fascinating. The shortest war reminds us that sometimes the biggest changes happen not gradually, but in explosive moments that are over, before anyone can fully process what's occurring. And sometimes what looks like a battle between two men is really about much larger forces, empires rising and falling, old worlds giving way to new ones, and the uncomfortable truth that having history on your side means nothing if you don't have cannons that work. Here's something they don't put in the official histories. Some of the most important decisions in Zanzibar weren't made in throne rooms or council chambers. They were made in quiet courtyards where fountains played, in shaded corridors that smelled of jasmine and rosewater, in the private quarters of the palace where women moved through spaces most men would never see. The royal household in 19th century Zanzibar was far more complex than the simple picture we often get. Yes, the Sultan had multiple wives and concubines. That part usually makes it into the history books. What doesn't always get mentioned is that these women weren't just decorative. They were educated, often multilingual, connected to powerful families across the Indian Ocean. They had their own networks, their own sources of information, their own agendas, and some of them were willing to use every tool at their disposal to advance those agendas. Let me tell you about someone who understood this better than most. Her name has been lost to most historical records. That's how effective she was at operating in shadows. But let's call her Safia, which was a common name in that era. Safia came to the palace as a young woman, perhaps 17 or 18, brought from the East African coast. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was clever. She spoke Swahili, Arabic, and a bit of Portuguese. She could read, which was unusual. And she had something else, a keen understanding of how power actually worked. Within a year of arriving at the palace, Safia had become one of the Sultan's favorites, not through any one thing, but through 1,000 small attentions. She learned which poems he liked and could recite them perfectly. She understood his moods, knew when to speak and when silence was wiser. She made herself indispensable not as a possession, but as a presence, someone whose company made difficult days easier and lonely evenings bearable. But here's where the story gets interesting. The German Empire, expanding its influence along the East African coast in the late 1800s, needed information from inside the Zanzibar palace. They needed to know what the Sultan was thinking, what the British were proposing, where the Sultanate's vulnerabilities lay. Direct spying was difficult. The palace was closely watched, but Safia, she had access to everything. It probably started small. A German merchant she'd known before coming to the palace, someone who'd helped her family once, asked her a simple question during a chance meeting at a market. Nothing important, just curiosity about whether the Sultan seemed happy with recent British trade proposals. Information that seemed harmless to share. Then another question, slightly more specific. Did she happen to overhear anything about the harbor expansion? Had the Sultan mentioned anything about German requests for a coaling station? Each answer led to another question, and gradually, almost without Safia realizing it was happening, she'd become a source. A valuable one. The palace, you have to understand, was like a small city. Dozens of servants, advisors, scribes, guards, all moving through interconnected spaces. Documents were everywhere. On desks in filing cabinets that weren't always locked. In the hands of messengers passing through corridors. And Safia had the run of the private quarters. When the Sultan received important correspondence, he'd often read it in his rooms. Sometimes he'd discuss it with her, seeking a perspective outside the usual circle of male advisors. Sometimes he'd simply leave papers on a table while he attended to other matters. She'd glance at a document. Remember key details. A proposed treaty with Britain, plans for new fortifications, the real state of the Sultanate's finances. Later, she'd arrange to be at the right market stall at the right time, where a brief conversation would pass along what she'd learned. Payment came in various forms. Money, yes, but also protection for her family, gifts that enhanced her status, promises of security no matter what happened to the current Sultan. This wasn't unusual, by the way. Every major power operating in Zanzibar, the British, the Germans, the French, even some Arab states, had their own networks of information. The palace leaked like a sieve because everyone from senior officials to kitchen staff had someone outside who wanted to know what was happening inside. What made Safia remarkable was her access and her discretion. She never got caught. The Germans used what she provided to stay one step ahead in negotiations. When the British proposed something, the Germans already knew about it and had prepared their counteroffer. When the Sultan was considering a new alliance, the Germans understood his reasoning before he'd even announced his decision. It gave them leverage, the ability to shape outcomes without anyone quite understanding how they were doing it. Now, imagine being Safia in this situation. She probably told herself she wasn't really betraying anyone. The Sultan was kind to her, but he was also using her. That's what the whole system was about. She had no real power, no security beyond what her beauty and usefulness provided. The Germans, at least, were offering her something, a measure of control over her own fate. Can you blame her for taking it? But espionage wasn't the only invisible force shaping Zanzibar's politics. There was another tool that rulers had been using for centuries and continued to refine in this era: the manipulation of religious sentiment. The sultans of Zanzibar were religious men, genuinely pious in many ways. They built mosques, supported religious scholars, led prayers, but they also understood that faith could be a tool of control, especially when the population was diverse and tensions were high. When you needed people to accept policies they might otherwise resist, wrapping those policies in religious language made them much harder to oppose. Consider how this worked in practice. In the late 1800s, when pressure was mounting to end various forms of forced labor, some religious leaders began preaching that the existing social order was divinely ordained. They'd cite texts, make theological arguments about hierarchy and obligation. It wasn't about cruelty, they'd explain from the pulpit. It was about God's plan for society. To oppose the system was to oppose divine will. This wasn't unique to Zanzibar, of course. Throughout history and across the world, people in power have discovered that religious authority is one of the most effective ways to maintain control. If you can convince people that your rule is sanctioned by God, then opposing you becomes not just politically dangerous but spiritually perilous. The Friday sermons in Stone Town's Grand Mosque were carefully orchestrated. The Sultan's advisors would meet with religious leaders beforehand, suggesting themes that might be worth discussing. Nothing too obvious. No one was standing at the pulpit reading from a script, but gentle guidance about what topics would be timely. A sermon about obedience during times of transition. A reminder about the importance of accepting one's place in society. A lesson about how change must come slowly, through proper channels, never through disruption. And it worked. When Winyimku and other leaders tried to organize resistance to unfair taxation, they faced not just political opposition, but religious condemnation. Some imams preached that refusing to pay taxes was a sin, that challenging the Sultan's authority violated Islamic principles of respecting legitimate rulers. It made organizing much harder when people weren't just afraid of earthly consequences, but worried about their souls. Here's where it gets uncomfortable for us looking back. This exact playbook is still used today. Around the world, we see leaders wrapping themselves in religious authority to justify policies that benefit the powerful at the expense of the powerless. We see faith being weaponized to shut down legitimate criticism, to silence voices asking uncomfortable questions, to maintain systems that desperately need changing. The difference between genuine religious conviction and its cynical manipulation for political control can be hard to spot from the outside. Some of Zanzibar's sultans probably believed their own rhetoric. They saw themselves as faithful leaders trying to preserve order and tradition in chaotic times. Others were more calculating, understanding exactly how they were using faith as a tool. The common people in Zanzibar weren't fooled, at least not entirely. There's a Swahili saying that emerged during this period that roughly translates to, "The Sultan prays loudly so you won't hear his coffers closing." People noticed the contradiction between sermons about humility and charity, while the palace expanded and taxes increased. But noticing didn't mean you could safely say anything about it. Safia, from her unique position, saw all of this clearly. She'd watched the Sultan prepare for Friday prayers, genuinely engaged in spiritual preparation, Then she'd see him meet with advisors afterward to discuss how religious leaders could help quell unrest in the countryside. Was he a hypocrite? Not exactly. He probably believed he was serving both God and good governance, but he also knew the political value of religious authority and wasn't shy about using it. Remember those ships Bargash burned back in 1872? Here's where that mystery starts to make sense. Bargash was under intense British pressure to end certain practices. The British had threatened economic sanctions, had made clear they could destroy his fleet any time they wanted. But Bargash couldn't simply comply. It would look weak to his own people and to other Arab rulers who were watching. So he burned the ships himself, made it a ceremonial act, framed it in religious terms as a sacrifice, a purification. He gave sermons about renewal and moving toward a more enlightened future blessed by God. It let him do what the British wanted while appearing to make the choice himself, for spiritual rather than political reasons. Clever, in a cynical sort of way. The women of the palace, like Safia, understood these games perhaps better than anyone. They lived in a world where nothing was quite what it seemed, where every conversation might have multiple layers of meaning, where survival depended on reading people and situations with extraordinary accuracy. Some probably felt guilty about the roles they played. Others saw it as simply navigating the reality they'd been born into. Most, I suspect, felt complicated mixtures of both. What's fascinating is how little of this makes it into traditional histories. We get the names of sultans, the dates of treaties, the outcomes of conflicts. We rarely get the story of how information actually flowed, how decisions were really influenced, how power operated in the shadows behind the official narrative. Yet these hidden dynamics often mattered more than the public events everyone wrote about. Looking at Zanzibar's palace intrigue reminds us that history is always more complex than the simple stories we tell about it. Yes, there were sultans making proclamations and foreign powers making demands. But there were also clever women passing secrets, religious leaders crafting sermons to order, merchants whispering in corridors, servants overhearing conversations, a whole ecosystem of influence and manipulation happening just out of sight. And before we judge too harshly, we should recognize that every center of power works this way to some degree. Today's capitals have their own Safias, their own ways of using faith for political ends, their own hidden networks of influence. The specific mechanisms change, but the fundamental dynamics remain remarkably similar. Power rarely works the way civics textbooks describe. It works through relationships, secrets, carefully managed appearances, and the thousand small ways people find to advance their interests while maintaining plausible deniability. Afia, if she really existed in the form I've described, probably lived out her years comfortably. The Germans would have taken care of their sources. She might have ended up with a house of her own, financial security, maybe even respect in certain circles who knew what she'd accomplished. Or maybe she eventually got caught, faced consequences we'll never know about. The historical record is silent on so many of these individual stories. What isn't silent is the broader pattern. Behind every public decision in Zanzibar, there were private machinations. Behind every religious sermon, there were political calculations. And behind the image of the palace as a place of exotic luxury, there was a complex web of intelligence gathering, manipulation, and survival strategies that would have impressed any modern spy agency. The curtain of power, once you peek behind it, reveals a stage far more crowded and interesting than most people ever realize. If you visit Zanzibar today, you'll step off the ferry into something that feels almost like a dream. The air still carries that distinctive sweetness. Cloves, yes, but also salt and frangipani blossoms. Stonetown's narrow alleys wind between buildings that seem to lean toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. Tour guides lead groups past intricately carved doors, explaining the symbolism in each pattern. Beach resorts advertise crystal waters and sunset dhow cruises. The island has reinvented itself as paradise, and in many ways, it succeeds beautifully. But here's what's interesting. Walk through those tourist areas, and you'll notice something. The plaques and signs talk about spice routes and sultanate grandeur. They mention the House of Wonders, the beautiful architecture, the cultural mixing of Arab and African traditions. What they mention less often, or gloss over quickly, is where all that wealth actually came from. The darker foundations upon which the island's golden age was built. The clove plantations are still there. You can visit them actually, as part of organized tours. A guide will show you the trees, explain how cloves are harvested, let you crush the dried buds between your fingers to release that pungent aroma. They'll tell you that Zanzibar still produces cloves, though nothing like the quantities that once made the island famous. Today, Indonesia has taken over as the world's primary supplier. Zanzibar's contribution is almost symbolic now, an echo of former glory. What the tour might not dwell on is who planted those original trees and under what conditions. The vast plantations that turned Zanzibar into a spice powerhouse weren't created by free laborers receiving fair wages. They were created by people who had no choice, working from dawn until their hands were stained dark and their backs ached beyond describing. The wealth that built those beautiful stone palaces came from human suffering, as much as from spice. Let me introduce you to someone, not a sultan this time, but someone whose descendants might actually be living in Zanzibar today. Her name was Asha, and she worked in the clove plantations in the mid-1800s. She'd been brought to the island as a teenager, torn from a village on the mainland that she'd never see again. By the time she was 25, clove harvesting was all she knew. Her fingers were perpetually stained. The smell had worked so deep into her skin that even after washing, that distinctive spice scent lingered. Asha had children on the island. They grew up in a strange in-between world. Born in Zanzibar, speaking Swahili, part of the island's population, yet never fully free to choose their own paths. When the systems of forced labor finally ended, officially at least in the late 1800s, Asha was already an older woman. Freedom, when it came, meant mainly the freedom to keep doing what she'd always done, but now getting paid a pittance instead of nothing at all. Her grandchildren stayed in Zanzibar. What else would they do? The island was their home, for better or worse. They knew its soil, its rhythms, its secrets. Some of them kept working in spice cultivation. Others found different paths, fishing, building, eventually working in the tourism industry that gradually became the island's new economic foundation. Fast forward to today. Zanzibar's economy now runs primarily on tourism. Visitors from around the world come to enjoy pristine beaches, to photograph those famous carved doors, to experience what marketing materials call authentic island culture. The hotels are beautiful. The restaurants serve fresh seafood and dishes spiced with locally grown cloves. Everything is designed to feel exotic but comfortable, adventurous but safe. And here's the uncomfortable question. What responsibility does tourism have to tell the complete story? When you're paying for paradise, do you want to hear about the suffering that helped create the wealth that built what you're looking at? Or is it okay to present a sanitized version, keeping the pretty parts while scrubbing away the troubling ones? Walk through the old slave market area in Stone Town, because yes, there's a memorial there now, and you'll find it's become a bit of a tourist attraction itself. There's an Anglican cathedral built deliberately on the site where the market once stood, a symbolic act meant to represent transformation and redemption. Underground chambers show where people were held. Informational plaques provide historical context. It's respectfully done, genuinely trying to educate. But then you walk 100 meters away and there's a cafe selling smoothies and postcards. The memorial exists in a kind of bubble, separate from the actual daily life of the island. Tourists visit it, take photos, feel somber for 15 minutes, then go back to enjoying their vacation, which, to be fair, is probably how most of us engage with difficult history anywhere. How much reflection can we sustain before we need to return to normal life? Here's what strikes me about Zanzibar's current situation. The clove trade that made the island wealthy is mostly gone. Indonesia produces far more at lower cost. The ivory trade that brought enormous money is thankfully dead, elephants having been protected. The dark commerce in human beings is over. So what's left? What remains of a culture that was built almost entirely on trade? The answer is complicated. The architecture remains. Those stone buildings with their Arab arches and carved doors represent a genuine cultural achievement, whatever we might think of how they were funded. The Swahili language and culture that developed from centuries of mixing African, Arab, and Persian influences is real and valuable. The traditions, the food, the music, these things have lives of their own now, independent of their origins. But there's also something haunting about walking through Stone Town and realizing that so much of what you're admiring was built on foundations we'd now consider deeply wrong. That beautiful palace, built with money from spice plantations worked by unfree laborers. That elegant merchant's house, funded by ivory that came at enormous environmental cost. Those narrow streets where you're shopping for souvenirs. They once channeled streams of people being bought and sold. Some of Asha's descendants, if we could trace her line, might be working in tourism today. Maybe serving drinks at a beach resort. Maybe carving souvenirs for visitors. Maybe guiding those spice plantation tours, explaining how cloves grow without mentioning how their great-great-grandmother's hands were permanently stained from harvesting them. Is that erasure? Or is it simply moving forward, building new identities not defined entirely by historical trauma? There's a philosophical question lurking here. When a culture is born primarily from commerce, what survives when that commerce changes or disappears? Zanzibar offers an interesting case study. The Sultanate defined itself through trade. It was a trading port first, everything else second. The sultans were merchants as much as rulers. The island's importance came entirely from its position in commercial networks. When those networks shifted, when steamships and changing global economics made Zanzibar less central, the Sultanate faded. By the early 20th century, it was essentially a British protectorate. After independence, first from Britain and then through union with Tanganyika to form Tanzania, Zanzibar had to figure out what it was beyond a trading hub. The answer it's arrived at is tourism, which is, in a way, still commerce. Still selling something, now experiences and aesthetics rather than spices and ivory. Still dependent on connections to the outside world, on visitors arriving with money to spend. In some ways, Zanzibar remains exactly what it always was, a place defined by exchange with elsewhere. But here's what has changed. The people who once had no say in how the island's commerce worked now have more agency. Not perfect agency. Tourism has its own forms of exploitation, its own inequalities. But contemporary Zanzibaris can choose, at least somewhat, how to present their island, which stories to tell, which parts of the past to emphasize. And they've largely chosen to emphasize beauty over darkness. The marketing is all sunset sails and spice tours and pristine beaches. You can find the difficult history if you look for it, but it's not the main narrative. Some critics argue this is dishonest, a whitewashing that disrespects those who suffered. Others contend that people have the right to define themselves by more than their worst historical moments, that constantly centering trauma isn't healthy or fair. I think about this whenever I see travel photos from Zanzibar. Someone's Instagram post showing a perfect beach sunset, palm trees silhouetted against orange sky, caption about paradise found. That image is real. The beach does look like that. The sunset is genuinely beautiful. But it's also incomplete. Just off frame is a much more complex story about how this island became what it is. About the human costs of the wealth that built those picturesque stone buildings you can see in the distance. The clove trees that still dot the island carry layered meanings now. They're agricultural products, yes, but also living monuments to a particular historical moment. Every harvest season, when workers climb the trees and spread the buds to dry in the sun, they're continuing a practice that's over 150 years old, one that shaped global trade and local lives in equal measure. Some plantations have tried to reckon with this history more honestly. There are a few where guides talk not just about botany, but about who actually did the work, what conditions were like, how the island's economy rested on exploitation. These tours are less popular than the cheerful spice and smile versions, but they exist for visitors who want deeper understanding. The question Zanzibar faces, the question many places with complicated pasts face, is how to honor history without being imprisoned by it. How to acknowledge that terrible things happened without defining an entire culture by those terrible things. How to move forward while still remembering. There's no perfect answer. Every choice about what to preserve, what to commemorate, what to market to tourists involves trade-offs. What's clear is that Zanzibar's legacy is genuinely mixed. Blood and spice, wealth and suffering, beauty and exploitation all tangled together in ways that can't be easily separated. The island gave the world flavors that changed cuisines across continents. It also participated in trades that caused immense harm. It created stunning architecture and literature. It also built that beauty on foundations of injustice. Today's visitors can choose how deeply they want to engage with that complexity. You can come for the beaches and beautiful doors and never think much about what came before. Or you can ask harder questions, seek out the less comfortable stories, try to understand the full picture. Both approaches shape what Zanzibar becomes through the simple fact of attention and money. What gets emphasized, preserved, remembered. For the islanders themselves, descendants of sultans and merchants and workers and everyone in between, the task is even more complex. They live inside this history rather than visiting it. They wake up in buildings that carry memories in their stones. They work in economies that have shifted but carry threads of continuity. They make daily choices about which parts of their inheritance to carry forward. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say is this: Zanzibar's story doesn't have a neat ending, because the story isn't over. The island continues evolving, continues negotiating between past and present, between memory and aspiration. The cloves still grow. The ocean still laps at Stone Town's foundations. And people still gather in those narrow streets, building lives that honor some parts of the past while trying to move beyond others. When a culture is born from commerce, what remains when commerce changes? In Zanzibar's case, the answer seems to be something real, something valuable, but also something haunted. A place beautiful enough to attract visitors from around the world, yet carrying shadows that no amount of tropical sunshine can completely dispel. And maybe that's as it should be. Maybe places with complicated pasts deserve to be understood as complicated, appreciated for what they've become while remembering how they got there. The legacy of blood and spice lives on, written in the very air you breathe when you step onto the island, whether you recognize that scent for what it truly carries or not. Let me tell you about how empires end. Not with armies at the gates, not with dramatic final battles, but quietly, like sand slipping through fingers no matter how tightly you try to hold it. Picture Zanzibar in the year 1900. The 20th century has just begun, full of promise and electric possibility. The island still smells of cloves drifting on warm air. Stone Town's carved doors still catch the morning light. Ships still arrive in the harbor, though fewer now, their captains less eager. Their holds not as full as they once were. Something has shifted, though if you'd asked people at the time, many couldn't quite name what had changed. The Sultanate still exists technically. There's still a palace, still a sultan making proclamations, still the daily rhythms of governance. But walk through those palace corridors now and you'll notice British advisors everywhere. In the treasury, in the customs house, in meetings about trade policy and tax collection. They're polite, always careful to frame their suggestions as suggestions. But everyone knows what happens if the Sultan ignores too many of these suggestions. Everyone remembers those 38 minutes. Here's what happened to all those dreams we've been following. The merchants who'd once grown wealthy on spice and ivory found their profits shrinking. Indonesian cloves flooded the market at lower prices. International agreements restricted ivory trade. The shipping routes that had made Zanzibar essential were shifting as steamships changed the calculus of trade, making direct routes to mainland ports more attractive. The island that had been the beating heart of Indian Ocean commerce was becoming, slowly but steadily, a backwater. The clove plantations still operated, but the owners were struggling. Prices had dropped by more than half from their peak. Workers who'd once been enslaved now technically received wages, but those wages were so low and the conditions so harsh that the practical difference felt minimal to the people actually climbing the trees and spreading the buds to dry. Freedom, when it finally came, turned out to be more complicated than anyone had imagined. Let me tell you about Rashid. He's the grandson of that merchant Syed we met earlier, the one who'd helped people escape. Rashid grew up hearing stories about Zanzibar's golden age, about when Stone Town was the place where deals were made that echoed across 3 continents. He'd walk through the same streets his grandfather had walked, past warehouses that now sat half empty, past merchant houses whose owners were quietly selling off their furniture, to pay debts. Rashid tried to continue the family trading business. He really did. He'd wake before dawn, go down to the harbor to check what ships had arrived overnight, try to negotiate deals for whatever goods were worth shipping. But the margins were thin, the competition fierce, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to catch water in a net. The world had moved on, and Zanzibar, for all its rich history, was being left behind. The sultans, one after another, faced impossible choices. They needed money to maintain their palaces, their administrations, their dignity as rulers. But the traditional sources of wealth were drying up, so they borrowed more from the British. And with each loan came more advisors, more influence, more erosion of actual authority. It was like watching someone slowly disappear, still visible but becoming more translucent with each passing year. In the year 1913, Sultan Khalifa bin Harub took the throne. He was a thoughtful man, educated, well-traveled. He understood exactly what was happening to his island. He could see the writing carved into stone as clearly as those Arabic inscriptions on the palace walls. Zanzibar was becoming a British protectorate in all but name. The question wasn't whether this would happen, but simply when it would be made official. Khalifa made a decision that some called pragmatic and others called surrender. He chose cooperation. He worked closely with British administrators, accepted their guidance, helped implement their policies. He told himself he was protecting his people, preserving what could be preserved, maintaining at least the appearance of Zanzibari authority. His critics said he was collaborating with colonizers, selling out the island's independence for personal comfort. Who was right? History doesn't offer easy answers. What we know is that under Khalifa's reign, Zanzibar remained relatively peaceful and stable, even as British control tightened. There were no dramatic rebellions, no repeat of Khalid's 38-minute war. Life went on. People worked, raised families, celebrated festivals, mourned losses, experienced the full range of human existence. But they did it increasingly under systems and structures imposed from London. The physical city began to change in subtle ways. British architectural styles started appearing alongside Arab and Swahili designs. New buildings had a different aesthetic, less ornate, more utilitarian. The old merchant palaces gradually fell into disrepair as their owners couldn't afford maintenance. Some were converted to other uses. Some simply crumbled. Beautiful carved doorways leading into empty rooms where plaster fell from walls and birds nested in corners. Rashid eventually gave up trying to maintain the trading business. There wasn't enough profit anymore to support a family, let alone employees and warehouses. He took a job working for a British import-export firm, using his knowledge of local markets and languages to help them navigate Zanzibar's commercial landscape. It paid better than his own struggling enterprise had. It also felt like defeat, working for the very system that had undermined merchants like his grandfather. Some evenings, Rashid would sit on what remained of his family's rooftop terrace and look out over the harbor. He'd watch the sun set over water that had once carried fortunes in every direction. He'd remember his grandfather's stories about when this island mattered, when decisions made here rippled outward to affect markets from Muscat to Mumbai. And he'd wonder what it meant that all those dreams had come down to this, clerking for a British firm, helping foreign merchants extract what remained of Zanzibar's value. The First World War changed things further. Zanzibar, as part of the British sphere, found itself involved in a European conflict that had nothing to do with clove harvests or ivory caravans. Young men from the island were recruited to serve in various capacities. Resources were redirected to support the war effort. And when the fighting finally ended in 1918, the world that emerged was even less interested in what a small East African island sultanate had to offer. By 1920, the question wasn't whether Zanzibar would maintain independence, but simply what form the official British takeover would take. The sultans remained, but everyone understood they were figureheads. The real decisions were made in colonial offices, by administrators who viewed the island primarily as the administrative unit to be managed efficiently. What happened to the people whose stories we've been following? Most adapted as best they could. The descendants of those who'd worked the clove plantations continued working them, now for wages that barely kept families fed. The children of merchants found new occupations, or left the island entirely. seeking opportunities elsewhere. The religious scholars continued teaching, though under increasing British scrutiny about what they taught and how. The women of the palace, like the descendants of our friend Safia, navigated new forms of limited power, finding agency where they could in a system designed to restrict it. Zanzibar became something it had never been before. Ordinary. Just another colonial possession, one of dozens scattered across the map painted in British imperial pink. The uniqueness that had once made the island special, its position as a crossroads of cultures and commerce, faded into historical memory. Tourists began arriving even then, drawn by stories of exotic spice islands and Arab sultanates. But they were visiting a museum, really, a place whose vital days were behind it. The revolution, when it finally came in 1964, shortly after independence from Britain, was swift and brutal. The Arab-descended elite who'd held power for so long found themselves suddenly and violently overthrown by revolutionaries, claiming to represent the African majority. Thousands were killed or expelled within days. The Sultan fled into exile, the last in a line stretching back over a century. It's tempting to view that revolution as justice, as colonized people finally taking back power from foreign-descended elites. And there's truth in that. But there's also tragedy in how it happened, in the violence and displacement, in the way historical grievances erupted into bloodshed. The people who died or lost everything in those chaotic days weren't responsible for the systems their ancestors had built. They were just people, born into circumstances they didn't choose, trying to build lives in the only home they'd ever known. Rashid, if he'd still been alive, would have been in his 60s by then. Maybe he'd have been one of those forced to flee. Or maybe he'd already left years earlier, seeing which way the winds were blowing. His children and grandchildren would have scattered, carrying Zanzibar in their memories and stories, but no longer able to return to the actual place. The family warehouse, if it still existed, would have been seized and repurposed. The house his great-grandfather had lived in would belong to someone else now. The family history erased, as if it had never been. Today, Zanzibar is part of Tanzania, semi-autonomous but firmly within the mainland nation's orbit. The sultans are gone. The great merchant families are scattered or vanished. The palaces have become museums or government offices, and the island survives primarily on tourism, selling packages of its past to visitors who want to experience exotic history without having to live through its complications. Walk through Stone Town now, and you'll see signs of all the layers we've explored. The carved doors that took craftsmen months to create still mark entrances to buildings repurposed a dozen times. The House of Wonders, that symbol of Bargash's modernization dreams, stood until it partially collapsed in 2015, a physical metaphor for how even the most ambitious structures eventually succumb to time and neglect. The old slave market site hosts a memorial and cathedral, attempting to acknowledge darkness while moving forward. And everywhere, the scent of cloves reminds you that some things persist even after everything else has changed. What's the lesson in all of this? If there is one, perhaps it's about the fragility of prosperity built on unstable foundations. Zanzibar's wealth came from its position in trade networks, from controlling goods that people elsewhere wanted desperately. But positions in trade networks shift. Technologies change what's valuable and how it moves. And when those shifts happen, places that seemed essential can become peripheral almost overnight. The sultans tried various strategies to maintain relevance and independence. Some modernized aggressively, like Bargash with his electric lights. Others cooperated with colonial powers like Khalifa. Still others resisted briefly and futilely, like Khalid. None of these approaches ultimately preserved the sultanate, because the fundamental dynamics had shifted beyond any individual ruler's ability to control. They were playing a game whose rules had changed, trying to win using strategies from an earlier era. For the common people of Zanzibar, the fall of the sultanate meant different things depending on who you were. For descendants of those brought to the island in chains, there was a complex mix of tragedy at their original displacement and relief that the systems of exploitation had finally, truly ended. For descendants of Arab and Indian merchants, there was loss of status and often physical displacement. For everyone, there was the challenge of building new identities in a place whose defining characteristics had vanished. Rashid's descendants, if we could find them, might be anywhere now. Living in Oman, where some of the expelled Arab families fled. In Kenya or Tanzania, integrated into mainland society. Perhaps even in Europe or North America. Carrying Zanzibar in their surnames and family stories, but disconnected from the physical island. Or maybe some remained, adapting to each new reality, finding ways to belong in a Zanzibar that bears their ancestors' fingerprints, but no longer their names. The kingdom of contrasts, as we called it at the beginning, ultimately couldn't sustain those contrasts. The light and darkness, the faith and greed, the dreams and exploitation, all eventually collapsed under their own weight. Not through invasion, not through dramatic conquest, but through slow erosion as the world changed around an island that couldn't change fast enough to keep up. And yet, Zanzibar endures. Not as a sultanate, not as a trade power, but as a place where people live and work and dream. The clove trees still grow, tended now by farmers who own their land or work for wages they can negotiate. The ocean still laps at Stone Town's foundations, carrying dhows that now ferry tourists rather than trade goods. The call to prayer still echoes through streets where multiple languages mix, though the languages and proportions have shifted. Perhaps that's the real story here. Not the rise and fall of sultans and their dreams, but the continuity of human life in a place that keeps adapting, keeps surviving, keeps finding ways to matter even after its moment of historical prominence has passed. The island that was once worth an empire now offers something different. Beauty, history, lessons about what happens when we build too much on too little, when we forget that prosperity must be shared to be sustainable, when we allow inequality to grow until it tears societies apart. If you've stayed with me through this long journey from Zanzibar's golden age to its quiet transformation, you understand something important about how history actually works. It's not neat, it's not simple, and the ending isn't really an ending at all, just another transition, another chapter in a story that continues as long as people live in places and try to make sense of what came before. The medieval archives brings you these stories because they matter beyond their immediate facts. They're mirrors reflecting truths about power and dreams, about how we build and what we build on, about consequences that echo across generations. Zanzibar's story is simultaneously unique and universal, specific to one island, yet revealing patterns that appear everywhere people gather to trade and dream and struggle for better futures. The empire of cloves and ivory is gone, but the questions it raises about wealth and justice, about progress and cost, about what we're willing to sacrifice for prosperity, remain as relevant today as they were when Sultan Bargash watched his ships burn, or when Rashid stood on his rooftop wondering what had happened to his grandfather's dreams. History isn't about dates and names. It's about people like us, facing choices that seemed clearer in hindsight than they ever did in the moment, building worlds that would outlast them in ways they couldn't predict. Zanzibar's sultanate lasted barely over a century as an independent power, but the market left on global trade, on cultural mixing, on architectural traditions, and yes, on the painful legacies of exploitation, continues to shape the world we inhabit today. That's why we remember. Not to celebrate or condemn from comfortable distance, but to understand how we got here, what worked and what didn't, what dreams soared and which ones crashed. Every fragrant breeze carrying the scent of cloves is a reminder. History isn't over. We're living it, making our own choices, building foundations that future generations will judge. The only question is whether we'll learn from stories like Zanzibar's or be doomed to repeat them in different forms. The Sultanate ended, but the story continues, and in that continuation lies both warning and hope.